Welcome to heartofashepherd.com. I appreciate you being a part of our continued chronological study of the Scriptures. Now, our Scripture reading for today is Proverbs 31 and 1 Kings chapter 12. I've titled the devotional, Israel and Judah, a Divided Kingdom. So this will be the first of two daily devotionals for Monday, December the 18th, 2023. Well, a word of introduction. Now, three men had reigned as king in Israel as we come to 1 Kings chapter 12. Now, the first was Saul, who was of the tribe of Benjamin. Now, after Saul, the Lord chose David to reign, and he was the son of Jesse and of the tribe of Judah. Now, because he was a man after God's heart, the Lord established a lasting covenant with David and his lineage, and one that will be ultimately fulfilled when Jesus Christ returns to reign as the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Well, that's a little bit of the background. Let's consider the verses that preceded 1 Kings chapter 12, and that would take us back to the last verses of chapter 11. Now, I want you to notice the beginning of the tumultuous reign of Rehoboam. Now, according to 1 Kings 11 and verse 43, King Solomon died, and we read in verse 43, and Rehoboam his son reigned in his stead. And so began a new and tragic phase in Israel's history. Now, Rehoboam succeeded in the role his father served for 40 years. And the young king was soon tested. And tragically, rather than humble himself and seek the Lord for wisdom, Rehoboam's heart was lifted with pride, and thus he failed to take the opportunity to solidify his reign as king in Israel. And that brings us to 1 Kings chapter 12. Now here we have Rehoboam, who was crowned king in Shechem, a city that held a significant place in Israel's history. Now, Shechem was the first place Abraham camped in the Promised Land, Genesis chapter 12. It was also where Joshua addressed Israel before his death in Joshua chapter 24, and by the way, where the bones of Joseph were interred after the tribes of Israel returned to their homeland. That's found Joshua 24 and verse 32. And so, as we come to 1 Kings chapter 12, we find Rehoboam as king of all Israel. But also now, beginning in verse 2, we read about the return of a man named Jeroboam. Now, he was Solomon's enemy, and he returns to Israel hearing that Solomon was dead. Now, Jeroboam, a little bit of background, had fled to Egypt during Solomon's reign, for the king recognized he was a threat to his crown and the peace of Israel, 1 Kings 11. Now, soon after Solomon died, the men in Israel, and I quote, sent and called Jeroboam to return to Israel, chapter 12 and verse 3. Now, Jeroboam, emboldened by Solomon's death, became the opposing voice of the northern 10 tribes in Israel. Now, speaking on behalf of those 10 tribes, Jeroboam, challenged Rehoboam and demanded the burdens that Solomon placed on the people be decreased. We know that during Solomon's reign, he had increased the taxes and also had forced labor on many of his construction projects. Well, looking at chapter 12 and verses 5 through 14, we find Rehoboam turning to his counselors for advice. Now, in verse 5, Rehoboam requested 3 days to consider his response to Jeroboam's demands. And so the young king first appealed to the men who served as his father's advisors. They were obviously older and experienced, and so those older men, the counselors of Solomon, counseled Rehoboam to approach the people with humility like a servant. Now, those elder counselors advised him to speak kindly to the people, and they would become his servants forever. Well, the young king, however, rejected the counsel of his elders in verse 8, and instead he turned to his peers, and we see them described in verse 8 as young men that were grown up with him, and withstood before him. These were all men, probably sons of some of the great leaders of Solomon's kingdom. Well, now their sons are ready to take the reins of authority, and sadly, there will be great sorrow that will follow. Now, those sons, revealing their youthful zeal and courting Rehoboam's favor, they told him and counseled him to mock the people's request for lighter burdens and urged him to approach the people with both pride and disdain. Somebody might would say, let's teach him who the boss is. Well, he's going to soon find that does not go well. And so those young peers of Rehoboam, however, they urged the king, deny the people's demands, and thus set the stage, sadly, for fulfilling a proverb. Proverbs 16 and verse 18 we read, pride goeth before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. Well, on the third day, Jeroboam and the people came before the king at the appointed time in chapter 12 and verse 12. Rehoboam followed the advice of his peers, and he boasted and he spoke harshly to the people, and he provoked the children of Israel to rebel. Now notice with me verse 15. And I would characterize this as a foolish king, but also a lesson in God's sovereignty. Here we read, wherefore the king hearkened not unto the people, for the cause was from the Lord, that he might perform his sayings, which the Lord spake by Ahijah the Shilonite unto Jeroboam the son of Nebat, in chapter 12 and verse 15. Well, King Rehoboam's words and actions, though contrary to the counsel of his elders, accomplished the Lord's purpose. You see, the Lord foretold how Solomon's sins would cause Israel to become a divided nation during his son's reign. And thus the prophecy and purpose were fulfilled in verse 15. And so, beginning in verse 16 and through verse 24, we have the rebellion of Israel's northern 10 tribes. Now, the children of Israel rejected Rehoboam as king, and when the king sent a tax collector to demand tribute, they killed him. Now, after hearing what was done, Rehoboam fled to Jerusalem for safety in verses 18 and 19. And the children of Israel, that is the northern 10 tribes, then we read, made Jeroboam king over all Israel. Now, all Israel would be the 10 tribes of the north. And we read, continuing verse 20 and 21, there was none that followed the house of David, but the tribe of Judah only with the tribe of Benjamin. So out of the 12 tribes that he inherited as the nation of Israel, Rehoboam, because of his pride, ended up seeing that kingdom divided. 10 tribes go with Jeroboam, who we will find is a wicked man, and only 2 of the tribes, Judah, his home tribe, and Benjamin being the tribe whose land is within the kingdom of Judah itself. And so Rehoboam, then we read in verse 21, raised an army of 180,000 men for the tribes of Judah and Benjamin, and he would have gone to war against his brethren in the north, the 10 tribes. However, God intervened, and we read in verses 22 through 24 that he sent a prophet, and he demanded no war in Israel. Well, beginning in verse 25 through verse 33, the reign of Jeroboam begins, and he will be the first king of the northern 10 tribes. The Jeroboam knew the people made annual pilgrimages to Jerusalem according to the law, and so the temple would become a place of worship for the people. Because of that, Jeroboam had a fear that the people would return to Judah, to Jerusalem, to the temple, and be reunited with the nation. And so, taking counsel from those who had joined his rebellion, Jeroboam determined he would establish a religion with his gods. Well, he fashioned his idols after the likeness of heathen gods, and we read that Jeroboam made 2 calves of gold, and he said unto the people, it is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Behold, thy gods, O Israel, which brought thee out of the land of Egypt. Verse 28. Of course, these golden calves are a reminder of the idolatry of Israel in the wilderness. As Moses had gone up to Mount Sinai, you might remember that his brother Aaron had, because of the demand of the people, had shaped a golden calf. And Moses learned that they were dancing around that golden calf. Well, Jeroboam now makes the same mistake, and he chooses to credit those golden calves of his own mind and dreams to be that which Israel would worship, that they might not go back to Jerusalem. Well, Jeroboam never confessed his motive for establishing idolatry in Israel. Instead, he excused his wickedness, reasoning that Jerusalem was too much or too far away for the people. It kind of reminds me today of some of the excuses of people that will compromise where they worship because another place that might be faithful and true to the word is, well, it's just too far. Sadly, that did not work out so well for Israel, neither will it for anyone that chooses to compromise their faith and their practice because it's too far. Well, Jeroboam lied, and he altered Israel's history. And we've already read that he attributed his golden calves as the gods that had delivered the Hebrews out of Egypt. Rather than Jerusalem and the temple, Jeroboam ordained two cities to serve as places of worship, Bethel and Dan. It's interesting how the devil always makes an alternative more convenient. While understanding the priests and Levites would refuse to participate in Israel's idolatry, Jeroboam, we read, chose men to be priests. And what was the character of these men? According to 1 Kings 12 and verse 31, they were of the lowest of the people. He then established feast days to replace those that the Lord had ordained. It appears that Jeroboam himself ordained himself to sacrifice to his gods, for we read in verse 33, he offered upon the altar and burnt incense. Well, closing thoughts. I want you to consider how quickly the children of Israel departed into idolatry. They rejected God, they rejected his law, and they rejected his commandments. They accepted Jeroboam's religious piety while rejecting the one true God whose temple was in Jerusalem. And finally, they ordained spiritual leaders like themselves who were of the lowest of the people. Well, lest you think we're not tempted to follow Israel's failures, think about the people who are in leadership in your church, your community, and your nation. And too often, the lowest, that is the unqualified, the disgruntled, those lacking spiritual vitality and passion for the Lord, those who are morally compromised, too often the lowest of the people are appointed and promoted to leadership. It's true in politics, and sadly too often it's true even in our churches. May you and I exercise godly discernment and not look for something that is convenient. May we be people of conviction. Well, thank you for being a part of today's Heart of a Shepherd. I do invite you, feel free to reach out to me if these lessons are a blessing. Subscribe to Heart of a Shepherd Inc., the YouTube channel, and to www.heartofashepherd.com for daily devotionals. God bless you, and bye-bye.